Welcome everyone to our webinar for January, our first webinar of 2024 on preventive action through risk-based thinking. My name is Melanie Ross, and I'm going to be your presenter today. We appreciate you joining us for this complimentary webinar, and please note that we are recording the webinar, and the recording will be available later for viewing on our website. Just some logistics before we get started. All attendees are muted. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and enter those into the Q&A box within WebEx, and we will answer those questions at the end of the webinar. I have left time at the end to answer any questions that you may have. So we're going to jump right into our webinar today. Our key takeaways for our webinar is understanding risk-based thinking. We're going to talk about what is risk-based thinking and why was risk-based thinking put into a lot of the different ISO standards. We're going to look at those requirements for risk-based thinking that flow through a lot of the different ISO standards that organizations use for certification and accreditation. Then we're going to look at how we can use risk-based thinking as a preventive action process. Risk-based thinking was meant to replace that preventive action process in our ISO standards. So we're going to look at how we can do that throughout the operations of an organization. Then we're also going to look at how risk-based thinking can enhance opportunities. Oftentimes when we think of risk, we think of the negative connotations, but when we look at risk, it should also allow us to take some of those opportunities as well. So why did we decide that this would be our first webinar for 2024? In some of our assessments and some of our discussions with our assessors, there's still a little bit of confusion about what is risk-based thinking and what happened to preventive action. 2017, the 17025 edition or 17025 standard revised in 2017, and it replaced preventive action with this risk-based thinking. And the goal of that was to encourage organizations to use risk-based thinking as an ongoing activity to prevent nonconformities from occurring. Oftentimes, preventive actions were an afterthought. Something happens, we fix it, we move on, or we think something's going to happen, we put something in place and move on. When we look at risk-based thinking, it really incorporates risk-based thinking throughout the organization and not just as a one and done or a one-time process. So when we look at the requirements for risk-based thinking, we're going to see that even though the term risk is only used a couple times in the standards, risk-based thinking is really infused into how you should be performing your processes on a daily basis. While the requirements of risk-based thinking are only in the management system requirements of the standard, again, the word risk is in impartiality and in management systems, we really want to look at embedding that risk-based thinking throughout our technical requirements, throughout our technical operations, and throughout our management system as a whole. So very plain and simply, ISO 9000:2015 in 3.7.9 defines risk as the effect of uncertainty. It's a very broad definition. So we have risk when we're uncertain of an outcome. We're uncertain if something's going to happen or not. We're uncertain if there's an opportunity for us as well. So it's a very broad definition that we can then narrow down into a much more succinct definition when we look at what is risk from an organizational perspective. So when we look at the effect of uncertainty, we can look at risk as a deviation from what is expected or what is inferred. So we expect something to happen and there's a risk that it may or may not happen. It's usually caused by a shortage of information, misinformation, or misinterpretation of information. Again, I said at the very beginning, risk can be positive or negative. Oftentimes, when we think about risk, we think about those negative things that can happen, the nonconformities that can occur, the nonconforming work that can occur. But we also take risks when we take opportunities. So we want to think about how we can incorporate risk-based thinking into our operations to not only counteract those negative things that could happen, but also to enhance the opportunities that we may have as an organization. So when we further that into what is risk-based thinking is the consideration of potential events, consequences, and likelihood of occurrence. And again, the aim is to prevent potential negative events from occurring, but also to enhance those opportunities. So we think about what can go wrong and what can go right, and what can we do about it to prevent what goes wrong from going wrong and what goes right to go right. Now, if we look at the historical term of preventive action is defined as the action to eliminate the cause of a potential nonconformity. When we look at that further, it's an action taken to prevent the occurrence of something bad. So when we look at preventive action versus risk-based thinking, then it's pretty similar. So our risk-based thinking is looking at consequences, likelihood of things going wrong, and our preventive action is looking at ways to eliminate the causes of things going wrong. So really, risk-based thinking replaces that preventive action and makes it a mindset instead of an action. So we talk about preventive action, that's something we take, an action we take. If we use the term risk-based thinking, that's a mindset that the organization has to infuse that risk-based thinking throughout the operations of the organization. So now, why did we shift from preventive action to risk-based thinking? I said at the beginning, preventive action was often a forgotten process. We're going along on our day-to-day operations and we see on the horizon something may go wrong. And so we take a tiny shift and we fix that so that it doesn't go wrong. That's really not effective for continuous improvement because we're not documenting what those actions were oftentimes, and we're not learning from those actions that we're taking to prevent things from going wrong or from enhancing an opportunity. When we look at risk-based thinking, on the other hand, it is again integrated into our management system. It's integrated into the way that we perform our processes. It's integrated into the way that we train our employees. Risk-based thinking can be considered a proactive approach to preventive action because risk-based thinking is much more than just preventive action. Risk-based thinking includes preventive action, but it also includes some correction, some corrective action. It can include aspects of our internal audits and our management reviews. So it really flows throughout the management system and technical operations as, again, more of a mindset than a simple action being taken on a singular nonconformity or on a singular potential nonconformity. So when we look at risk-based thinking, our preventive action is built into our management system. So risk-based thinking is strategic rather than procedural. So I know that most of the ISO standards have requirements in the management system about addressing risks and opportunities, and we're going to look at some of those requirements here in a little bit. But we want to think about those requirements are not meant to just sit right there in the management system section of the standard. They're meant to make it a strategic aspect of your organization. So risk-based thinking is a manner of continuous improvement. When we think risk-based thinking, then we embed that continuous improvement mindset into the culture of our organization. We consider risks and opportunities in all processes. It can also be beneficial if we tie our risk-based thinking and our continuous improvement to our organizational objectives. So senior management sets organizational objectives. You have goals set into the organization as well. And you look at risk-based thinking on how can you enhance those goals? How can you meet those objectives? And what roadblocks might get in your way in the process of meeting those objectives? Using risk-based thinking will allow you to, again, embed that into your organization and enhance the opportunity for meeting your organizational objectives and meeting your goals through your metrics. When we look at what is needed for risk-based thinking, it's actually fairly simple, but can seem complex. So on a very simple level, that first line, we identify our risks and opportunities. Well, that sounds pretty simple, but when you start thinking about it, how many risks may be out there? When you think of an internal context and an external context, and you think about just the risks to the organization, this is not a one and done process. We need to continuously look at risks and continuously look at opportunities to determine if we have identified all of those. In that identification step, we are looking at all the things that could possibly go wrong and all the things that we want to go right. We can also identify risks and opportunities through other management system processes, such as our corrective action process, our internal audits, our customer feedback, our personnel feedback. Because you think about it, if you identify a risk and we move on and we plan actions to implement it, and then that risk occurs, then maybe our actions weren't effective in addressing that risk. So the first step, we want to identify those risks and opportunities. Then we want to plan and implement actions to address the risks and opportunities. Now, these are simple steps that are in most of the ISO standards that incorporate risk-based thinking. We go further into that plan and implement actions to address risks and opportunities in thinking of which risks and opportunities do we want to plan actions for. This is where we want to look at the likelihood and the consequences. Each risk or each opportunity is not going to be addressed in the same manner or with the same number of resources, the same amount of time, that sort of thing. So we want to look at those risks and opportunities and make sure that we understand what are the most important to address for the organization, what's going to increase our effectiveness of the management system, what's going to prevent those negative effects, and how are we going to improve our results. So that's why I said we should infuse our risk-based thinking throughout the processes of your organization, because then you're consistently and continuously looking at risks from every aspect, and you're being able to target those risks and opportunities that are going to improve the bottom line. And when I say bottom line, I don't necessarily mean money. I mean the bottom line, the product, the process, the customer satisfaction, less rework, all of those things that cost us time and money, we can start to address through that risk-based thinking. Now, when we look at the standard requirements for risk-based thinking, I'm not focused on one singular standard. From an ANAB perspective, our accreditation standards are 17025 and 17020. 6.5, a lot of different numbers in there, but risk-based thinking is also incorporated into a lot of the management system standards. So it started with ISO 9001 for quality management systems. That's where it began when ISO 9001 was updated during 2005, I believe. I was trying to think of the year. So the common requirements that are in most ISO standards that have risk-based thinking incorporated into them are risks to impartiality. So those are looking at how do we manage impartiality in our organization. And then the second one is those addressing risks and opportunities requirements that are in the management system requirements of most of the standards. And where these common requirements come from is from ISO CASCO, who develops the ISO standards. Their technical and working groups develop and edit ISO standards. They have common requirements and a common approach to writing these conformity assessment standards. And the risks to impartiality and addressing risks and opportunities are included in those common requirements, kind of to harmonize these standards so that if organizations have certifications and accreditations to multiple ISO standards, their risk-based thinking approach can be the same across those standards. So they can have an integrated management system that covers all of the standard requirements. Now, again, the addressing risks and opportunities requirements are in the management system requirements. And the goal of that is that management system is what is supposed to support the organizational operations. That supports our business, supports all of the processes that we perform. And if we think about taking those requirements that are in Clause 8 or Clause 9, depending on which standard you're looking at, and infusing them back through, then we start reading the requirements in the standard in a risk-based thinking mindset. So if we think about internal audits, in the 17025 standard, internal audits are required to be planned and scheduled based on the results of previous audits, the activities in the area. I'm paraphrasing here, not reading the actual standard. But when we actually look at the words that are there, it's saying plan your audits based on risk. Plan your audits based on areas that may have more risk infused in them. They may need to have more audits than other areas. What opportunities do you have to improve that audit program? So you think about all of the standard requirements and all of the shalls and how they're worded, and then you say, how can risk-based thinking help me improve this process? How can I infuse risk-based thinking into this process? And as you start doing that as an organization, it will flow out from the quality management system or from the quality department. And again, it will become that culture. It will become embedded in your operations, and everyone will be thinking about risks and opportunities as they perform their operations or their assigned duties. And then that makes risk-based thinking a constant. It makes it something that is being thought about all the time, and it's not something that's one and done. It's something we're always looking at. We're always looking at how to improve, how to get better results, have less rework, spin our wheels less, so to speak. So if you haven't noticed yet, risk-based thinking is a proactive approach. It's not a reactive. So our corrective actions are our reaction. Something happens, we figure out why, and then we do something to make sure it doesn't happen again. So with risk-based thinking, we are looking out and saying what can go wrong. And one of the examples that I like to use for the proactive approach, especially this time of year in the United States in the area I'm in, because we had an ice storm over the weekend, is if you have an icy sidewalk outside of your building, and someone slips and falls, and then you go out and you put the ice melt on the sidewalk to melt the ice, that's corrective action. If you see that it's going to ice, that ice is going to come down, it's going to sleet, it's going to snow, and you go out and you put the ice melt, the salt, out first, that's you identifying a risk. And that's you risk-based thinking. You see that there's a risk that the sidewalk's going to get icy and that someone could slip. So that's our preventive action. We're preventing, we're being proactive in making sure that the sidewalk is safe to walk on. Now that's a very simple example, but as you start to apply that to your operations, you can really see how risk-based thinking can be infused into the work that you're doing. So it's basically a three-step approach. You identify your risk or your opportunity, you mitigate it or treat it to some degree, and then you monitor to make sure that those mitigation efforts worked. And now you can see that it is a triangle and the arrows go from each box because, again, it's not a one and done. Risk-based thinking is something that we should be doing all the time. It's not something we sit in a room, get all our risks, put them in a register, and move on and never think about it again. It really should be something that's on the forefront of your mind, where you're thinking about how can we proactively address risks that are on the horizon, and how can we proactively go after any opportunities that may be out there for our organization as appropriate. I mentioned a couple of these already, where we have our sources of risk identification. Not listed on here is your people. So the biggest source of risk identification is asking the question, what can go wrong? What are some of the risks that our organization faces for this process or that process? You know, we can talk about impartiality, or we can say contract review. So we can also find out different risks to our organization through that contract review process. If you have a contract review process, external customers that are coming to you to develop a product or develop a test or perform a calibration, risk-based thinking is infused in that process in the standard requirements in saying, do you have the capabilities to do this work? Do you have the resources to do the work? Do you have the time? All of those things. Are you using the correct method? Those are all risk-based thinking questions. When we look at our internal audits, we're going through the organization as a whole and looking at the processes that are being performed and saying, are there any gaps? Are there any areas where we're not meeting the requirements? Whether that's the requirement of a standard or our own internal requirements or our customer requirements, those need to be addressed through your corrective action process, but they also need to be identified and acknowledged as risks that weren't identified previously. That's the same for your corrective actions. If a nonconformity occurs or nonconforming work occurs, that's a risk to the organization. So that should be considered as something that is a risk, that should be on your list of risks. However you identify your risks and document those risks, it should be on there. The same as with complaints. Now, not all complaints turn into a risk identification opportunity, but there are some complaints that come in that could be used to learn for the future to prevent that from happening again, or to prevent something similar to that complaint from happening again. And then in management review. So in most of the ISO standards, the only area that it says to document your risk identification is in management review. And it's one bullet point that says results of risk identification. It doesn't give a lot of detail there, and it can be a variety of different ways that organizations do talk about those results of risk identification, but the management review as a whole can be a way to identify other risks in other areas of the organization, because you're looking at those metrics, you're looking at the numbers, you're looking at your policies and your procedures and the results of the work that's being performed and external assessments, and all those things can all feed into your risk-based thinking. So if you haven't noticed yet, all of these things feed together in one system, one management system that has risk as a safety net around it. So we're always looking at those risks and opportunities and continuously improving our operations. When I said what was risk, defining risk, it was looking at the consequences and the likelihood of a risk to occur. And when I said that we need to address our risks or mitigate our risks, I said that we want to talk about which risks we need to address first and which risks maybe are okay just to hold on to retain with information. We know that we have the risk, but we retain that. One of the ways to do that is to look at what's the consequence of this risk if it did occur. So we want to talk about an impact analysis. We look at, is it going to be a trivial impact to our organization if this risk actually happens? Well, then maybe it's okay that we don't take any actions to mitigate it. But when we get to that far right side where we see there could be an extreme impact to the organization, it may benefit your organization to go ahead and mitigate that risk, to go ahead and find an action that can be taken to make sure that that risk doesn't occur. Or if it's an opportunity missed, and that could be an extreme impact to your organization, then you may want to do what you can to take that opportunity. We look at consequences, but we also look at likelihood. So the consequence could be extreme to the organization, but it could be rare that it's actually going to happen. So we combine those consequences and likelihood to determine, again, which risks we should be addressing. Those risks that have an extreme or a major impact to the organization, and they're likely or very likely to happen, we probably want to do something to address them and do something fairly quickly to address them. Those that would rarely happen and have a moderate to low impact on the organization, it may be beneficial to do something to mitigate those risks or take that opportunity. but it's not critical. It's not mission critical that could impact the product, the process, the customer, your organization as a whole. So as you're looking at risks, now there's no requirement to evaluate the consequence and likelihood. This is just good practice so that you can prioritize what it is that your organization is going to address. Because if risk-based thinking is new or is something that you're slowly incorporating into your management system, it can be pretty overwhelming at first, especially if you ask anyone in the organization, what are some risks? You get a list of even 20 risks, and that can be overwhelming of what you want to address. So looking at the consequences and the likelihood just gives you a mechanism to say, these are our priority now. Once those are addressed, reprioritize, come back to the table and determine if there's others that need to be addressed as well. When we get a little further into what is a simple risk analysis process, we can look at a little more detail. So I had my 3 bubbles on that proactive approach of identify, mitigate, monitor. And here's a little bit more detail on what that process can look like. So we start there on the upper right side with list risks related to your organization. Again, this can be overwhelming to do, and it has to be an iterative process. It's not a one and done. Now, it can be that you do it once a year, or it could be that it's an ongoing process. That's up to your organization, but it should definitely be something that you're consistently looking at to continuously update, because things change. Internal impact or internal context, external context, the method you're performing, your customers, lots of things change. So those risks are not necessarily going to stay as solid risks that have the same consequence and likelihood consistently across time. So once you have your list of risks related to your organization, or maybe take a simple process, take one process and look at the risk related to that, just as a way to get started. Then we rank our risks on likelihood and consequence, likelihood, consequence, or severity, likelihood of occurrence, I can't speak right now, and severity of consequences. Usually those extreme, rare, those words have numbers to them. Numbers make it easier to address. So if you rank your likelihood of occurrence 1 through 5, and you rank your severity of consequences 1 through 5, and then you multiply those numbers together or add those numbers together, either way, that will give you a priority. It'll give you a priority of what to address. Then we take that top priority risk and we develop an action plan based on our rankings. So the top one first, and then work our way down. These action plans, to benefit your organization, the action plans should be documented. They should be assigned to someone. They should make sense, and they should be a part of your change management process. Now, I'm using the word should here. I'm talking about best practices. There's no specific requirements in the standard to do these things. But from my experience and from looking at other organizations that are successful in risk-based thinking, these are the best practices that they use. Those action plans are detailed. What's going to be done? Who's going to do it? How are we going to make sure that it's incorporated into the management system? And then we record those results. And by recording the results, what we mean is we are recording the effectiveness of the actions taken. We identified a risk. It's snowing outside. We took an action. Our plan was to put down salt or ice melt. Was that successful? Is everybody getting into the building okay? Is the sidewalk not slippery? We record those results and then we track our progress. So as it continues to snow, do we need to continue to ice the sidewalk, or is it good the way that it was? And then you can see that our circle continues around with those arrows, because it is a continuous process. It's repetitive. So even if we get our list of risks and we know those are every single risk our organization has, we still have to go through this iterative, repetitive process in going down the list of risks in the ranking that we have. So we address the first one, then we address the second one, then we address the third one. So again, risk-based thinking is a form of preventive action. It uses preventive action to eliminate potential risks. So we're taking actions to prevent that risk from occurring. Those actions that we can take there's so many different actions, but we could change a process. We could add additional resources, or we could train our personnel. Maybe one of our risks is non-conforming work could occur, and we want to train people a little more in the process that they're performing. Now, when we look at obtaining resources, training personnel, and changing processes, that takes time and that may take money. So that's where that risk ranking comes into play, is to say those things that have a high impact and are highly likely to occur are the ones that we're going to put our resources on first. So we want to reduce the consequence or the impact of that risk. So there may not be a way to mitigate a risk fully. It may still occur, but we may be able to reduce that consequence. Maybe now, rather than an extreme consequence, it's a moderate consequence. And then that last row says reduce the likelihood or the probability. That means for, again, reducing the likelihood that it's going to happen or the probability that it's going to happen. We also could flip those words around and say we want to enhance the impact of an opportunity, and we want to enhance the likelihood of an opportunity. We get stuck with that risk-based thinking because the term risk has that negative connotation that we're always looking at what can go wrong, but we also want to look at what are those opportunities that we may have as an organization. So what is an opportunity? This is a risk occurrence that would have a favorable impact. So it's something that we can add to our business. We can add a process or add a new product or add something to our scope of accreditation. It's a condition or state with a potential to lead to a benefit or gain. So that benefit or gain, typically when we're thinking about organizational objectives, is money, more to the bottom line. It can get us more customers. It can improve our customer satisfaction. It has potential beneficial effects. And we say potential because those opportunities may or may not occur. So we look at that likelihood and we look at the consequence. So it may have that beneficial effect or it may not. Another definition is a situation from which an organization can derive benefit. And then the last definition is a risk that would have a positive effect on one or more objectives. And I really like that last definition there, a risk that would have a positive effect on one or more objectives, because that's bringing that word risk into our definition of opportunities, so that when we think about risk-based thinking, that we are including those opportunities as part of what we're looking at when we're creating our risk register or our list of risks, that opportunities are also included in that. I mentioned a couple of these already. When we think about opportunities related to risk-based thinking, that could be expanding our business operations. That could be getting new customers. It could be future thinking and planning. Where do we want to go? Our strategic direction. Or it can help us gain insight into our internal and external issues. When we're looking at our internal and external issues, oftentimes those are hard to see the forest for the trees. And looking at it from a risk-based thinking, what could go right, what could go wrong, what's on the horizon, can help us to capture those opportunities and mitigate those risks before they occur. In conclusion, when we look at what risk-based thinking is, risk-based thinking should be embedded in your organizational operations. If you look at the requirements of any of the ISO standards with the mindset of risk-based thinking, you will see those words turn into how can I incorporate risk-based thinking into this process. Most of the requirements of the standards have risk-based thinking as an undertone, and that can help make it into your organizational operations and not just an afterthought or just a process that's done outside of the day-to-day operations. It's good practice to tie risk-based thinking to your organizational objectives. Look at those objectives as a way to say what could go wrong and make us not meet our objectives, or what could go right and make us meet those objectives even more than what our initial goal was. It's proactive. I've said that throughout the presentation. It's a proactive approach to preventive action. It's a proactive approach to ensuring that risk does not occur, that non-conforming work does not occur, that non-conformities don't occur. And obviously the last one, it's useful to mitigate risk and enhance opportunities. We use risk-based thinking to improve our organizational operations, to improve our personnel, to improve our processes so that we have fewer nonconformities, we have fewer nonconforming work, that we have an organization that has a continuous improvement mindset. So we've had a couple of questions come into the chat or into the Q&A. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter them into that Q&A and we will get to them after I go over a few additional resources that ANAB has. ANAB offers webcasts, which are free pre-recorded videos providing additional information on accreditation and standard requirements. You can find those on our website. And again, they are free. You just click on them and watch them. They're about 5 to 15 minutes long, but depending on the topic. If you have any ideas for webcasts in the future, you can send those to our email address, anab@anab.org, which I will bring up here in a second. Our webinars, we offer these webinars monthly. This was our first one of 2024. And next month, we are going to have a webinar on property and evidence, which is a new program that ANAB launched that we want to get some information out to the public on. We will have them monthly and they are recorded. So you can come back to our website and listen to that recording at any time. We also have our blogs. Our blogs are on our ANSI website. Those blogs are a variety of different topics on standards, on conformity assessment, and on related topics as well. We just had a blog go up on the fundamentals of internal auditing, so you can take a look at that blog going to the web address here. And then we also offer training. We have a variety of different formats for our training. We offer training live online mostly, but we do also offer in-person training. We have a gap analysis training going on tomorrow in Columbus, Ohio. And we also have a whole catalog of self-paced training that you can take a look at as well. And so now we will get into your questions. I need to minimize the screen since I'm here alone today. The first question that I had was, is risk-based thinking also in 15189-2022? I am not 100% familiar with the 2022 edition of 15189. If it is incorporated into that standard, it will be in the management system requirements of the standard. ANAB does provide accreditation to that standard, but I'm not one of the assessors for that standard currently. If you give me 1 second, I will get to our next question. The next question is, can we get a copy of the slides to aid in training our people on this? So the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be posted on our website probably next week. So you can have that recording to use that as training for your people. Then we also had a question come in about what is the best way to start with risk-based thinking? That's a very broad question, but I think the best way to start, in my humble opinion, the best way to start is to ask your personnel what can go wrong in your process. So start small. Don't think the entire organization when you first start. Start very small. Take a single process. Maybe take your internal audit process and say, how can we plan our audits based on risk? Or what can go wrong in our internal audit program? So one of the things that could go wrong, we don't perform our audits when they're scheduled. We don't capture all of the nonconformities that we thought we saw during the internal audit. So when you're asking people to say what can go wrong and what opportunities do we have, it can be overwhelming at first because you may get a ton of different answers right off the bat, but it allows for you to start incorporating that risk-based thinking into everyone's day-to-day operations. And I'm not seeing any other questions come in at this time. I will hold the webinar open for a few more minutes to see if we get any more questions. I do appreciate you all coming today and listening to this webinar. Again, it will be on our website, anab.ansi.org, for you to take a look at later in the future. Here is some of our contact information. If you have questions about our training that we offer, you can email training@anab.org. If you're interested in accreditation services, or if you have additional questions about risk-based thinking, about the standards that ANAB accredits to, you can send those to anab@anab.org, and they will get to the appropriate person to answer those questions. Okay, we did get another question come in. How do you address risks that are beyond the purview of your organization? Like in your example, environmental risks to your facility where your organization doesn't have ultimate control of your facility. That is an excellent question. So we do identify risks at times that we don't have control over, that we may not be able to control the likelihood. So it is going to happen. That's where we retain that risk with informed decision. So internally, we have to do something in order to mitigate the impact on our organization, to minimize that consequence to our organization, right? So if it's an environmental risk, what can you do internally to mitigate that? So we think about it, if you think about for an organization that has a proprietary method, and there's no proficiency testing available for that method. Well, that's a risk to the organization because proficiency testing is one way that we ensure validity of results. So they have to mitigate that risk in some way. They can't make PT providers get a PT for it. So they have to mitigate that risk in other areas of their organization. So if you're, again, talking about those environmental risks, maybe it's cross-contamination through the ventilation system. Maybe you can install some local HEPA filters or something like that. And then we have a comment, and I appreciate your comment. When reviewing risks to impartiality, we should ask first, what are we already doing? Many organizations have been doing this for a long time, but not identified as risk management. Dan, that is an excellent point that I did not bring up, that I'm starting as risk-based thinking is totally new. It's not. Most organizations consider risks, they just don't call it that. So we just didn't say it was risk management. So in his example of impartiality, organizations already have impartiality agreements. They already have confidentialities, non-compete, all of those things from a legal perspective that we now are looking at from a management system perspective. So that's a very, very good point. So you may already have some of these things in place that you just didn't consider as risk-based thinking until now. The next question, how to incorporate the risk-based thinking in the strategic planning of the laboratory. So you definitely can look at risk-based thinking when you are doing your strategic planning. So you come up with your objectives as part of your strategy. You're looking at your vision, your mission, your objectives, and then your goals. And you're looking at how can our goals support our objectives and what could go wrong that we could not meet them, or what can we enhance to make it a better opportunity for the organization. So that's one way to look at it. I always go with what can go wrong. What if we don't meet our goals? Then what do we do? So it's kind of an if-then statement, using that in your strategic planning. Then the next one, are the probability and likelihood ratings usually the same for risks and opportunities? If not, what are some examples for rating opportunities? So the wording would be different in how you're writing the words. So it wouldn't be an extreme impact to the organization. It would be a positive impact to the organization. So you would want to think about treating those. So think about it from a backwards perspective. You want to enhance opportunities that give you the most bang for your buck, that give you the most improvements to your processes, improvements to your business, more customers, all of those things. And so if you look at your ranking system from that aspect, take one of those opportunities that you know you want to go after, and how would that ranking give that the highest number? So you do have to do a reasonableness check when you're doing these rankings to say, are we really ranking our risks and our opportunities in the right order? Are we putting our resources on the right thing? And not just trusting that number if you are using a number, if you're ranking them at all, but saying, are we pointing our resources in the right area to mitigate the risks that have the most impact to our product, process, customer, and enhancing those opportunities that are going to give us the best opportunity to improve our business? And then the next question, is there a best practice for getting executive leadership to support the risk-based thinking so that you have support? I don't think there's a best practice. I think just talking about it, showing where, like Dan had commented, where there's already a process in place for impartiality. We're just saying it's a risk to the organization if people aren't impartial. So that's where you really want to get that leadership buy-in, as far as, you know, you talk the talk, and then they'll start talking the talk too, and start talking about risk, because they'll see that it is really infused in the organization, rather than this outside process that's kind of spinning around on its own, doing its own thing so you can check the box for your certification or your accreditation. Then we have, do you have any webinars on how to assign risk ratings, develop the metrics for risk ratings? No, we don't. This is, I think, our first webinar specifically on risk-based thinking. So we didn't get further down into how you do it, because it really is unique to each organization and to the intent of the risk assessment that you're performing on how you want to do that. Now, when I have developed risk-based thinking or risk ratings in the past, prior to working at ANAB, I have looked on Google, and that's where I've gotten some good information. There's lots of different images that you can look at, and then tailor it to what makes sense to you. Again, back to that reasonableness check, making sure that you're putting your resources in the right areas of mitigating risks and enhancing opportunities. Then can you provide an example of an opportunity? I used to call those on my risk assessment, and I removed it because I could never identify a positive risk. Yeah, so there's a lot of different examples of opportunities. I had a few of them up on the slide previously, but an opportunity could be a new market. So you're producing a product that could be marketed to a new demographic. So the one that comes to mind for me is the Stanley Cup. Right, the Stanleys, they're not new, but everybody wants a Stanley to drink their water out of. Well, those Stanley Cups used to be marketed to farmers, and that specific one flopped. They weren't going to make it anymore. It didn't sell. Well, they looked at, I'm assuming, did a risk assessment and said, what is an opportunity here? And they said, why don't we market it to influencers? Why don't we market it to the people that want to have their water every day, to moms and teachers and people that carry those cups with them? And you know what? It took off. So that's an opportunity from a business perspective. We can look at other opportunities of adding new technology. So maybe looking at our external context. There's a regulation coming out that is, and I'm just making this up, a regulation coming out that says XYZ can no longer be used as a reagent in a process because it's a carcinogen. Well, looking ahead, an opportunity there would be to develop a new technology so that you're ahead of the game. You're still mitigating risk, because that would be a risk to the organization, but the opportunity is bringing in that new technology. Anyone else has any examples of opportunities that maybe your organization has taken? You can put them in the Q&A as well. That's really where we're getting our comments. Then the next one, so it would seem that some organizations are calling risk-based management escape prevention management. This webinar sounded extremely close to what my organization does already. We just call it escape prevention. Am I correct in assuming that? Yes, so I'm assuming that you're in the aerospace industry because they use the term escape instead of non-conforming work or non-conformity. But yeah, it's the same thing. So I think escape prevention management is more so specifically looking at the product rather than everything in general. But if that is how your organization looks at risks, then that's one way to do it. Again, the standards, most of the standards are not prescriptive in how you do it, just that you're doing it. And the goal of that is to continuously improve. So if your program of escape prevention management continuously improves your organization, you're meeting the goal of the risk-based thinking requirements of the standard. And then we've got a comment, Project Management Institute offers many resources on risk management, which mirror the points discussed today. So that's pmi.org. I agree, that's a good resource. There's lots of good resources out there for you to implement your own risk-based thinking that fits your organization. So that's the key here. Is I said a lot of shoulds and I said a lot of things that work from my perspective, all the laboratories that I've assessed and the organizations I've been a quality manager of, but it really is unique to your organization, the context of your organization, the management support that you have, and the maturity of your management system. And then we have one more question here. Can you summarize how/when to document risk-based thinking for auditors to see if this requirement is fulfilled? That is always a challenge, because if we're looking at specifically talking about 17025 or 9001, it doesn't say that you have to document your risks. But all of us quality professionals, quality assurance, quality management, quality control, from 9001 way long ago, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen, right? It didn't occur. So, the best way, it really depends on your organization, but the best way that I've seen it done for most organizations is some sort of table, whether that's in Word or Excel, that lists the risk, it lists the consequence, the likelihood, what mitigations you're going to do, and that way you can keep track of it. And then you can also continue to add to it as things go wrong and things go right. So you have a nonconformity, you have a corrective action, you go back and you look at your risk list, and that risk wasn't on there. Well, now you can identify it from a lessons learned to have it on there to say, now we know that that's a potential risk, and this is how we mitigated it. So, it really just depends on, again, the maturity of your management system and what works best for your organization. As far as being an assessor and going into laboratories, I've seen it down from, I talked with senior leadership and they told me what the risks were. And as I interviewed personnel throughout the organization, they were all aware of them as well, all the way to a full workbook in Excel that had multiple tabs that were linked together, that were linked to their corrective action system, that were color coded, that had every risk under the sun that could possibly happen. So I've seen it from one end of the spectrum to the other. The biggest thing, really, from my perspective, Melanie's perspective, is it's evident in the processes that you're performing as part of an audit or an assessment if risk-based thinking is in that mindset. So it is something that you can see is infused in the organization if non-conforming work is being identified, if processes are being updated as appropriate or as necessary, that your internal audits are performed on time, that sort of thing. So really, you just have to consider what works for you. And if you start down one path, say an Excel spreadsheet, and that doesn't work for you, it's never updated, it's not consulted, it's just not working, then try something different. And then our last comment that we have here is ISO 31000-2018 for risk management. Yes, that should have been in my presentation as a reference for risk management. It is a very practical guide. It's very helpful. It does have a lot of different risk management strategies in it. And it references a lot of other ISO documents that are guidance documents that you can use to help you get on your way. The biggest thing is just try not to get overwhelmed, try not to bite off more than you can chew, so to speak, if you don't have a process in place. And then, like Dan said, you probably are already doing risk-based thinking in some areas of your organization, and you can leverage those to move risk-based thinking into other areas as well. All right, I think I got them all. Let me see. Let me just make sure. Yeah, I had a second list there, but all of those were on the other one. Well, I really appreciate you all coming to the webinar again today and all of the questions that you had. The questions make the webinars much more fun. Keep an eye out on our website for our future webinars. Again, next month is property and evidence. And we are always looking for topics. So if you have a topic that you want covered on a webinar, I'm not saying that we definitely will cover it, but just send it to that ANAB@anab.org and we'll take a look at that.